Morning, everybody. Good morning. Let me try that again. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Wonderful, wonderful. You're doing a Baptist minister proud now. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Mike and David and Transform Rockford for allowing me to come and to speak to you this morning and to also be a part of the listening sessions that we had on yesterday. They were really wonderful sessions. I love talking to young people, and so we were at an elementary school, we were at the high school, and we were at the juvenile detention facility, and where I think some of the most insightful and interesting conversations were had there. And I want to thank Reverend Board and Sister Board for just carrying me around the city and just taking care of my needs. I'm not sure where they are. Yeah, there you go. You're back there in the back. You heard that big voice, right? I want to just thank the both of them. They're just wonderful people. What I'd like to do is just tell you my story. You know, the wonderful thing about TED is that you have to do all of that within a very short period of time. But I'd like to just give you an idea of who I am and my experience and where I am. And I'd like for you to do two things as I do that. I'd like for you to think about your city and about where you are and where you would like to be. And then as you listen to my journey, I'd like for you to think about your own journey of leadership within the city and see the places where your journey intersects with mine. And so I'm Jeffrey Brown. I pastored a church in the Boston area. I lived in Dorchester, and I was a part of a public safety crime reduction strategy that saw a 79% reduction in violent crime in a major city over an 8-year period. But I didn't start off, wanting to be a part of somebody's crime reduction strategy. If you would have said, to me, you're going to be working, with gangs and drug dealers on the street, prostitutes, anybody on the street, and then you're going to be working with police officers and probation officers and city folks in order to reduce crime. I'd have looked into your cup to see what you were actually drinking. When I started pastoring, I just graduated from seminary, and I was in this church, and I was continuing my education. And if you would have asked me, what's your ambition? I would have said, I want to be a mega church pastor. Y'all know what that is, right? I wanted 15, 20,000 members. I wanted my own television ministry. I wanted my own clothing line. I wanted to be your developer in the area. Come on, somebody ought to say amen to that. After about pastoring a year, the membership went up about 20 members. So, megachurchdom was way down the road for me, right? But seriously, if you had said, what is your ambition? I would have said, just to be a good pastor, to be able to give messages that would affect the lives of people, to be able to, build programs in the church that would be helpful to folks, to be with the families through all the passages of life, birth of children, going to school, through all the crises when someone gets sick, to visit them in the hospital, and in all of the final transitions, when the matriarchs and patriarchs die, and you're there to gather the family to remember a life that was well lived. To be a good pastor for me was also to be a good community leader. So, I wanted to be there in those community events, just trying to make the whole community move forward, And I wanted to play that role. I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, I wanted the nice, suit and a, brim hat and black car, and roll the window down and wave when someone said they go to Reverend Doctor. People being called bishop, people being called apostle, I was like, that sounds interesting to me. But the honest truth is, I just wanted to do what God wanted me to do. But there was something else that was happening in my city that was affecting my city and all of us, and that was the homicide rate. It started to rise precipitously. And there were young people who were shooting and killing each other for reasons that we thought were very trivial reasons. Somebody stepping on someone's sneaker in a high school hallway, And then after school, you know, when I was growing up, you might engage in fisticuffs, but after school, this person would get shot. Or someone who would be standing at the wrong street corner with the wrong color shirt on and the wrong hat on at the wrong time. And because they were there, they would get shot as a result. Or two young men who were vying for the affections of a young woman, and she chooses one, and then the one that she doesn't choose shoots the one that she does choose. You know, reasons I thought were trivial reasons, and something needed to be done about it. And so I looked at what I had. I had this pulpit, I had this congregation coming from the community that I spoke to every week. I had this nonprofit, you know, in the church that I could build programs. And so I started preaching the crime, the violence in the community, and I started to build programs for at-risk youth in my church. And I would go to my ministerium meetings and I would encourage my colleagues. I said, you know, we have to shift in this way. We have to start preaching in this way. We have to start building programs in this way. And many of them did. They started preaching the crime, the violence, and they started building their own programs in their own areas. And I thought, this is the faith contribution to this crisis. So if we all do this and we do this together, somehow we'll be able to get a hold of this violence. The problem was, as laudable as it is, it didn't work. The violence started to careen out of control. In one year, we had 152 homicides, 1,100 gun shootings. That means 1,100 people were shot in the city. People were getting shot for random things, you know, going to the convenience store to buy a pack of cigarettes, or just sitting on a bus stop just waiting for a bus, or kids who were getting shot in the park who were playing in the park, and the violence that was happening on the other side of the park, the bullets were coming their way. And you remember, bullets don't have names on them. And so people were just getting hit all over the place. And it started to change the character of the city. You can go to any housing project, like the one down the street from my church, and you go in there and walk in, and it would be like a ghost town because the parents were afraid to allow their kids to come out and play. You could listen in the neighborhoods on any given night, and to the untrained ear, it sounded like fireworks, but it was gunfire. You'd hear gunfire almost every single night somewhere in the city. And you can go to any emergency room at any hospital, at any area in the city, and you'd walk in and you'd see on any given night young black men, young Latino men shot, dying. And I was doing funerals, but not just the funerals of those venerated matriarchs and patriarchs, you know, who've lived a long life and you got a lot to say. But I was doing funerals of 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds, and a 14-year-old. And just standing there in front of the family and friends, you know, at a funeral home or at the church, struggling to say something that could impact them in some way. And I wasn't doing just one or two, I was doing dozens. Soon it would be hundreds of these funerals. And something needed to be done. And I realized that what I was doing was not enough. And so I started to look at the sermons that I was preaching, you know, and I started preaching harder, you know, and I tried to be innovative in my sermons. I mean, you all know rap music, right? I even tried to do a rap sermon one time, you know. It didn't work. But, you know, at least I tried, right? You know, I thought, you know, you can give me some points for that, right? But I remember that day. I remember this kid coming up to me after service. You know, I would shake people's hands as they would leave the church. He waited till everybody was gone. Then he walks up to me and he was like, "Rap sermon, huh, Rev?" And I was like, "Yeah, man, what you think about that?" He said, "Don't do that again, Rev. Don't do that again." So I was preaching harder. I was looking at the programs that I had built in the church and tried to tweak those programs. Somehow, something needed to be done. There was a woman who was going around the city and the communities and the cities around the state touting a solution to the violence. She was a member of a state-run group called the Governor's Alliance Against Drugs. She was coming to the housing project down the street from my church. And she was saying, "We've got a solution here." And so I decided to go and hear what she had to say, I mean, since I was a community leader. What she said to me, I'll say to you, it chilled me when I heard it. She said, this scourge of violence that we're experiencing right now, it's being done by a lost generation of youth. You might have heard that phrase before, lost generation. Her solution to the violence was this, though. We need to take our time, our talent, and our resources, and we need to concentrate them on the generation coming up. Because this generation that's experiencing this violence, it's a lost generation. When I walked out of there, 2 questions burned inside of me. The first was, how can a community survive minus an entire generation? Then the second question was, if we decide to concentrate our time, our talent, our resources on the generation coming up, very likely they are the children of the generation that we've just thrown out. So I realized that wasn't the answer. But the question was, what is the answer? And then something happened to me that changed everything. There was a young man by the name of Jesse McKee. He was walking home to the housing project down the street from my church with his friend Rigoberto Carrion. They met up with a group of youth that we later identified as the Van Peel Kings. It was a Dorchester-based group. And they were there in this project to see friends. They knew who Jesse was because Jesse had an after-school job at a radio station, so he was a pretty popular kid. The day before, Jesse had bought a brand new leather jacket. And so as they started talking to them, they started looking at the jacket, started asking them questions, you know, what kind of leather, how much did it cost, where'd you get it from? And then they tried to take it from him. He refused to give it to them, so they killed him. And they killed his friend Rigoberto simply because he was a witness to the whole thing. They tell me that as he was running from the scene, mortally wounded, that Jesse was running in the direction of my church, and he died some 100 and 150 yards away from the church. Not to say that he was trying to get to the church, because there were other buildings there, but if he would have gotten to the church, it wouldn't have made any difference, because the lights were out and nobody was home. And when I got there later on and they told me about what happened, it was an image that I just couldn't get out of my mind. Here we've got this young man in desperate need of help, running towards the church, but if he would have gotten to the church wouldn't have been there to help him. Lights were out, nobody was home. A few days later, they caught some of the guys who had done this deed. And to my shock, to my horror, they were only a few years younger than myself at the time. But the gulf that was between us was vast. It was like we were in 2 completely different worlds. And so for days and days and weeks, I wrestled with this imagery of this young man needing help from the church. Church would not have been there to help him. And these young men who had done this deed, who were part of my own generation, but we did not know each other. We were in 2 completely different worlds. And as I contemplated that, a funny kind of paradox started to emerge. And the paradox was this. In all of the sermonizing that I had done, you know, decrying the violence, you know, including that rap sermon, by the way, I was also preaching about building community. But I suddenly realized that there was a certain segment of the population that I had cut out of my definition of community. And so the paradox was this: if I really wanted the community that I was preaching for, I needed to redefine my sense of community and reach out and embrace these people that I cut out of my definition, which meant not building programs for those youth who were on the fence to violence, those who were at risk to violence, but to reach out to those who were committing the acts of violence, you know, the gangbangers, the drug dealers. As soon as that realization came to mind, a quick question came to my head, which was, why me? I mean, you know, isn't this a law enforcement issue? And then why we got the police, right? Soon as I said, why me, the answer came just as quickly. Why me? Because I'm the one who can't sleep at night thinking about it. Because I'm the one that's sitting around, looking around, saying, somebody needs to do something about this. And I'm starting to realize that that someone is me. I mean, isn't this how movements happen anyway? They don't happen with a grand convention and everybody comes together and come up with an agreement and sort of walk out in lockstep together. But it happens with just a few people getting together, or maybe just one person making a decision because nobody else is doing it. That's what happened to me. And so I said, all right, if I'm going to do this, I need to understand the culture by which they come out of. And so I started volunteering at the high school. After about a week of volunteering at the high school, I realized that the youth that I needed to reach, they weren't going to high school. So I started to walk out in the community, and it didn't take a rocket scientist to realize that they weren't out during the day. They were out at night, late at night. And so I started to walk the streets at night. I started to go and try to make connections. Did I know what I was doing? No, there's no template. There's no, instruction booklet that says this is what you do, But I did it because something needed to be done. And I knew that the answer did not lie within the four walls of my sanctuary, but it was outside of the four walls where they were. There were other ministers who were doing the same thing, coming to their own paradoxes, their own realizations. But we didn't know each other. We were all in our own neighborhoods doing our own thing. And then an incident occurred that brought us all together, and we called that incident the Morning Star incident. It was a funeral at the Morning Star Baptist Church, shooting that happened at a house party. It was actually a drive-by shooting. You all know what a drive-by shooting is. So back in those days, they used to just peel down the street and just sort of spray the street full of bullets. They saw that there was a party happening in one of the triple-decker apartments in Boston, and so they started concentrating their bullets in there, and about 4 or 5 people got hit, and a kid named Robert Odom was killed. During the wake of his funeral, a young man comes in off the street. And what the family knew about this young man was that he and Robert were in the same music class together, so they thought he was there to pay his respects, see his friend one last time. What the gang across the street from the church knew about this kid was that he was a member of a rival gang. They thought he was going in to disrespect the family, maybe even desecrate the body. They ran in after him. He sees them, they start running. They pull out their weapons. They start shooting in the middle of this wake. When the pastor comes out to see what's happening, they're stabbing this young man in front of the altar. And they called that the Morning Star incident. That night, that pastor got on the airwaves and said, a line has been crossed in the community. And it is time for the faith community to come together to talk about how we're going to respond to this violence. I'm calling for every available clergy from every available faith to come to my church this coming Tuesday, 7 o'clock, and we'll talk about how the faith community is going to respond. And that following Tuesday, over 350 clergy from across the Boston area came together to talk about how the faith community was going to respond. And when I say that everybody was there, I mean everybody was there. The Catholic cardinal and his entourage, the Greek Orthodox bishop and his entourage, the chair of the rabbinical council and his entourage, the Protestant heads of churches and their entourage, the imams from the mosques, their entourage. Anybody who wore a big ring or had a big medallion or swung incense, they were all there. And for about 2 hours, eloquent speeches were given. And after about 2 hours of speaking, they decided to take action. One, to call a press conference, to talk about how the faith community has come together to talk about how to deal with the violence. And then secondly, they decided to meet again the following Tuesday to talk about how the faith community was going to respond to the violence. And that following Tuesday, over 300 clergy came together again. And for about 2 hours, eloquent speeches were given. Those who didn't have a chance to speak the week before got a chance to speak. And then after 2 hours of speaking, they decided to take action, to meet again the following Tuesday to talk about how the faith community was going to respond to the violence. And that following Tuesday, about 250 clergy came together again. And for about 2 hours, eloquent speeches were given. And after about 2 hours of speaking, they decided to take action, to meet again the following Tuesday to talk about how the faith community was going to respond. You ever been in a process like that before? Somebody say amen. Amen. So after about, and do I have any preachers in the house? Y'all know. After about 9 weeks of this, and the numbers going down to about 70, the death knell was sounded to the process. Somebody got up and said, I think we should break off into committees. But during that period of time, I met Ray Hammond and Eugene Rivers and Hesse Harris and Gilbert Thompson and Nellie Yarbrough and Susie Thomas and Bob Fisher and Roland Robinson. And we weren't, you know, the pastors in charge. We were pastors, though. And our churches weren't the largest churches in the city. They weren't the most visible churches in the city. But we had people that we preached to. And we were all together, and we all started sitting together because we all had the same experience. All of us realized that the answer didn't lie within the four walls of our sanctuaries. We need to come out of the four walls of our sanctuaries and meet the youth where they were. And so we started doing that. And we used those meetings as a way to come together and talk about what we experienced that week when we did our walks. And so in that last meeting in which, you know, they were talking and wanted to do committees, one of us stood up and said, you know, we've been meeting here for over 2 months now, and we have not asked one young person to come in this meeting to tell us what it's like to be out there on the street. And then we ourselves have not gone out there to see what it's like, you know, to have this kind of experience. And so as a joke, those who were running the meeting said, all right, we'll nominate you as chair of the street committee. And then everybody laughs. But it was like, you know, the zeitgeist moment, you know. It was like the spirit was like right here. And so he said, all right, I want anybody who wants that experience to meet me at my house, 49 Harvard Street in Dorchester, this coming Friday at 10 p.m. And we'll start the street committee. And that Friday, 10 p.m., out of 350 clergy, there were 13 of us that arrived at the house of Reverend Eugene Rivers. Reverend Rivers lived in the Four Corners area of Dorchester. At that time, it was one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. It's a place where had a large concentration of youth between the ages of 16 and 24. Most shootings happened in that area. Police didn't like to go in the Four Corners. We were there at 10 p.m. I'll never forget that night, driving in, and I was like, oh my God, this boy lived in Four Corners. Parking my car, you know, under a street lamp, you know, nobody stealing my car. Walking into his house, looking to see who was there. He came downstairs from telling his son a bedtime story. He looks around. He was like, is this it? And I was like, this is it. And he said, all right, let's go. And then I said, go where? And he said, we're going out there. I said, okay, aren't we going to have like a strategy meeting or something, you know? Are we going to pray? We're ministers, for God's sake. Sure. He said, all right, let's pray. And then after that, off we went. We went up Algonquin Street, we made a right on the Washington Street, and we walked from 10 o'clock at night till 2, 3 in the morning. Then we started walking every Friday night and every Saturday night, 10 o'clock at night, 2, 3 in the morning. Then it was every Friday night and every Saturday night. And then anytime there was a crisis, you know, that happened in there, like if a shooting happened in the city, we would come together and just walk. Always walk the same route. At first, the youth didn't do a lot of talking to us, you know. I mean, we'd walk past, you know, we'd say hello, you know, sometimes they'd say hello. A lot of times they would see us coming and then cross over to the other side of the street and just watch us as we would go, right? Because I imagine we were quite the anomaly, right? I mean, you know, we weren't drug dealers, we weren't drug customers, we weren't gang members, we weren't the police. You know, some of us would have collars on, so I imagine it was just a crazy thing to look at. But after a while, they started coming up to us. We didn't have to go to them. They started walking to us. Matter of fact, they were meeting us at certain areas in the walks that we would do. We found out later that our walk actually cut through a few gang territories, and so they would meet us in their areas. And so we grabbed the group and we said, you know, we've been walking out here for a while and y'all wasn't speaking to us, so how come y'all talking to us now? And what they said was fascinating. They said, well, you know, we weren't talking to you, but the street, the word was just going through like wildfire that you all were out here. And so we were watching you the whole time. And we were making sure of two things. First of all, that you were going to keep coming out here, that you were going to be consistent in your behavior. You know how these things go. You have a crisis, you have this crisis response, and then the excitement dies down, and then the effort dies. But we kept going. And then secondly, they wanted to make sure that we weren't out there to exploit them. Because you know how that goes. You have somebody who says, you know, we're going to take back the streets. And they will go out into the street, and they always have a television camera with them or a reporter with them. And they would enhance their own reputation to the detriment of those who are out on the street. And if you think about it, the streets were never taken from us in the first place. We abandoned those streets. Come on, somebody. And we allowed youths to create their own worlds, and then they start crashing into ours, and we get offended. When they saw that we weren't out there for no grand glory, but we were out there to try to figure all this out, then they started talking to us. And then we did an amazing thing for preachers. We decided to listen and not preach. Amen. But that's how it went. We said to them, look, we don't know our own neighborhoods after 9 p.m. at night, you know, between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., right? But you do. You know, you all are the subject matter experts, if you will, you know, of 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. So talk to us. Help us to see what we're not seeing. Help us to understand what we're not understanding here. And we got an education that you could never get in a classroom, that you could never get by reading a book. We got an education about our own neighborhood in its totality. We heard about what life is really like on the streets. It's nothing like what forms in your mind after watching the 11 o'clock news. It's nothing like popular culture, you know, the movies or the, you know, the music that you hear, you know. The reality is very different from the glorification. And so in the midst of that, and listening and hearing what they're saying, we asked them a question. We said, we're not just clergy out here, but we also represent an institution in the community. One of the positive institutions in this community. We represent a church. So how do you see the church helping in this situation to reduce the violence in the community? And they came up with 10 areas that they thought would be helpful. So we put a plan around that. We called it 10-point plan. And then we put the coalition around the plan, and we called it 10-point coalition. But that's how we got started. We didn't get started by having a number of meetings and everybody coming out of a place in lockstep, but we started from the ground up, because that's where movements always start. And so as we started moving this and we started building these programs and building relationships with these youth, we suddenly realized that just our being in this was not going to be enough. There was just too many factors. The streets and the hood have gotten this way over decades of neglect. And so we needed more help. And we started to acquire partners, and our first partners were members of the Boston Police Department. Now, when you think about Boston and its history of race relations, you know it's no small thing when I tell you that we actually these black preachers actually partnered with white Irish Catholic police officers. Somebody ought to say amen. But let me tell you how it happened. It didn't happen from the top down. We didn't have a meeting with the commissioner and then the command staff and then a press conference and then talk with the district captains and blah, blah. But we, as we walked the streets, found out that the youth weren't the only people watching us on the street. But there were these gang unit officers who would drive past us in those unmarked Crown Victoria cars that everybody knows who they are. But we also got telephone calls from them. They said, we'd like to have a conversation with you. And so we would go over there to the Dunkin' Donuts and sit down and talk with them. And they would say, you were on Algonquin Street around 1 o'clock in the morning. We say, yeah, that was us. What y'all doing there? And as we started having this conversation, we suddenly realized that there was something shifting in the Boston Police Department. There were a couple of horrific events, racialized in nature, that really, really, really hobbled the police department. And so they had consent decrees and all of this stuff. And then a man named Bill Bratton became the commissioner. And he was committed to community policing. And he wanted community policing to be something more than police officers coming to a community meeting and then people complaining about the trash on the street or the street lamp that was broken. And he drove that down to his gang unit officers. And when he left Boston, a guy named Paul Evans took his place and drove it down even further. So you had these gang unit officers who were like, we have this mandate to do community policing, but we have absolutely no idea how to do this effectively. And so we said, well, let's have a conversation about that. And we started talking about the neighborhood that we were in, Four Corners. And we weren't talking about, sets and gangs and, their sweep techniques or anything like that. We started talking about the families. We started talking about the siblings. We started talking about the problems that were there. And we started to realize that we had a synergy. What they realized about us is that they had community leaders who saw what they had to deal with on a nightly basis. And what we saw in them were individuals who were committed to doing more than just locking everybody up, but they actually wanted the community to get better. Some of them still had family that lived in the community, and they just wanted it better for everyone. So we started to work with them. And we helped them to be more effective in their targeting of the violence. They would look at Magnolia Street, for example, and they would see 30 youth on Magnolia Street, and they would say, there are 30 members of the Magnolia Street gang. And we would say to them, listen, we work with Magnolia Street. You all think that there are 30 members of the Magnolia Street gang. There are only 12 youth who hail Magnolia. The other 18 youth just live on Magnolia Street. And you're trying to get at hardcore youth, those who shoot and carry the weapon. Of the 12, there are only 3 that fit your category. So here's the deal. You go after those 3, you leave the 27 to us so that we can work with them and find GED programs and job programs or get them to graduate from high school and go to college. And so we started to talk to them about how they would more effectively do their policing, and it started to work. And then we started to acquire these other partners. The next ones were probation officers. Because a lot of the youth, let me just be frank with you, a lot of the youth were court involved. So, they'd be on probation, and maybe they would have a violation or dirty urine or something, and they would come to us and say, look, you've been working with us, so can you come to the courthouse and, and stand with me and, tell the judge that I'm trying to do better? And I'm like, oh, sure, we'll do that. And then the judges pulled us aside and said, look, we're seeing this proliferation of clergy coming into our courtrooms. What's going on here? And we said, well, we're working with these youth on the street. And the probation officer was like, well, can we get in on that? We're like, sure, yeah, you can get in on it. And then we started having meetings with probation officers and police officers about the youth that we were working with on the street. And then an amazing thing happened. Probation officers started actually talking to police officers. Now, I thought that probation officers and police officers talked all the time. But I found out that that wasn't the case. Even as they worked with the same youth, there was no communication between them. But then they started talking. And with us there, they started to get a deeper understanding of what was going on in terms of family dynamics and so forth. And so we started working with them on that. And then city and community agencies came to the table because they started to get money for high-risk youth. But those youth weren't getting into the programs. So we would approach them and say, look, if you need some high-risk youth, we got some high-risk youth for you. We can put them in your program. And they started coming to the table. And then the private sector came in because as the violence started to go down, you know, the business climate started to improve. And so it made for a good case to support what we were doing. And then lastly, I don't know why lastly, you know, city government got involved in the whole mix. But in an 8-year period, we had a 79% reduction in violent crime. But the more remarkable number is this. When that first started happening, most of the shootings and the homicides that occurred were juvenile related. It was either juveniles who were getting shot or juveniles who were doing the shooting. We went from that high to a 29-month period in which we had 0 juvenile homicides. And they called that the Boston Miracle. People always ask, what was so miraculous about what you did? And we said, well, you know, the honest truth is it wasn't so much that the youth decided not to shoot each other. That was a factor, of course. But the real thing was that the adults decided not to shoot each other. That they decided to come together and check their egos at the door and realize that the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. I'll give you one example of that. I remember getting a call from the police commissioner. He calls me, he was like, what have you done to my men? And I was like, okay, Paul, you have to explain this one to me, right? What are you talking about? So he starts talking about this meeting that he has with his captains, you know, and I'm not sure what kind of meeting it is. I think it was some kind of equipment meeting where, you know, he kind of sits there and says, what do you want? And they say, well, we want guns, we want more guns, we want bigger guns. I mean, I don't know, right? But he sits there with his captains, and one captain says, I understand that there's some Justice Department money coming, and I would like to have a piece of that money because there is a youth program that I'm running in my district. And another captain says, well, if you're going to do that for him, I would like some release time for my officers, because they do a fundraiser running up the John Hancock Tower in Boston, raising money for the youth program in my district. Another captain says, well, if you're going to do that, then I'd like to have some Justice Department money because I also have a youth program in my district. And the commission knew that all those programs were related to 10-point churches. So he's calling me up and he's like, you know, you're turning my police officers into social workers. And I said, you think that's bad? There are clergy walking around here like they're police officers. It was the kind of synergy where people willingly started to do business differently. They started to see that despite whatever differences they had with each other, the larger issue was that people were dying and families were being shattered. And we have got to stop that. And so I'm happy to be here in Rockford, Illinois, because there are people here who are committed to making that happen. And if you let me help you, Rockford will be safer as a result. God bless you. Thank you.